Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in American history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing to what places and at what moments of the day or night these documented accounts reach. In 1850, when the American South was still bound by the chains of slavery, whispers began to circulate through the plantations of rural Georgia about a man whose very existence defied nature itself. The overseer's records from Whitfield County mention a Brazilian slave named Roque José Florencio, though the plantation workers knew him by another name entirely. They called him Dry Foot, a moniker that would echo through generations of hushed conversations and midnight confessions. The first documented mention of this man appears in a faded inventory ledger belonging to the Garrison family estate, a sprawling cotton plantation nestled between the Conestoga and Coosawattee rivers. The entry, written in the careful script of overseer Samuel Whitmore, describes the acquisition of a 30-year-old Brazilian slave of unusual height and constitution. What makes this entry particularly striking is not the clinical description of human property, but the marginal note scrawled in different ink. Medical examination postponed indefinitely. Doctor refuses further contact. The surrounding counties of Gordon, Murray, and Chattooga had seen their share of unusual occurrences during those turbulent decades. The Cherokee removal had left the land scarred with abandoned settlements and unmarked graves. Local folklore spoke of places where the earth itself seemed corrupted, where crops grew too tall or not at all, where livestock refused to graze. The Garrison plantation occupied one such tract, acquired at a suspiciously low price from the Federal Land Office in 1848. Dryfoot's arrival coincided with the first reports of what the plantation mistress, Eleanor Garrison, described in her private correspondence as unnatural fertility among both the livestock and the enslaved population. Her letters to her sister in Savannah, discovered decades later in a trunk beneath the floorboards of the main house, detail a growing sense of unease that pervaded the plantation from the moment the Brazilian was assigned to the breeding quarters. The term breeding quarters requires historical context to understand its full horror. On many southern plantations, enslaved people deemed to possess desirable physical characteristics were systematically paired to produce offspring who would become property of the plantation owner. The practice was meticulously documented, with bloodlines tracked like livestock breeding records. The Garrison Plantation's breeding program was among the most extensive in northwest Georgia, with detailed genealogical charts that survived the Civil War and were eventually donated to the State Historical Society. These records, archived in 1867, reveal an unprecedented pattern beginning in 1851. The number of births among enslaved women on the Garrison plantation increased by 300% over the course of 2 years. More disturbing still, the birth records consistently list the same father for dozens of children born within impossible timeframes. Medical knowledge of the era could not explain how one man could father multiple children born within days or weeks of each other to different mothers. Dr. Cornelius Wade, the county physician who attended births on several plantations, documented his observations in a medical journal that would later be classified by the State Medical Board and removed from circulation. Fragments of his notes, preserved in the personal papers of his nephew, describe physical anomalies among newborns that defied medical explanation. Children born with premature aging, unusual bone density, and growth rates that required constant adjustment of birth records to maintain plausibility. The local Methodist Church, where plantation births were traditionally recorded for baptismal purposes, began experiencing what Reverend Moses Pickering termed clerical difficulties in 1852. His weekly reports to the district supervisor mention repeated instances of ink fading from baptismal records, pages becoming mysteriously damaged, and an increasing reluctance among parishioners to discuss births on the Garrison plantation. The Reverend's final report, dated December 1852, contains only one line: "Some souls should remain unrecorded." Eleanor Garrison's mental state, as documented in her increasingly erratic correspondence, deteriorated rapidly during this period. Her letters describe sleepless nights filled with what she termed the sound of growing. She wrote of standing at her bedroom window, listening to what seemed like the collective breathing of dozens of infants, a rhythmic whisper that emanated from the slave quarters long after the usual sounds of evening had ceased. The overseer, Samuel Whitmore, maintained meticulous daily logs until the summer of 1853, when his entries became sparse and increasingly illegible. His final readable entry describes an incident that would haunt him for the remainder of his days. While conducting the weekly inventory of human property, he encountered Dryfoot in conversation with a group of children who appeared to be no more than 10 or 12 years old. What disturbed Whitmore was not the conversation itself, but the unmistakable family resemblance between the tall Brazilian and every child present, despite the impossibility of their ages given the timeline of births recorded in the plantation ledgers. The summer of 1853 brought other anomalies to the attention of neighboring plantation owners. James Morrison, whose property bordered the Garrison estate along Rocky Creek, reported finding dozens of small graves in the woods between the two plantations. The graves were unmarked, but arranged in precise rows, suggesting organized burial rather than random death. When Morrison approached Thomas Garrison about the matter, he was told the graves predated their ownership and likely contained Cherokee remains from the removal period. This explanation might have satisfied Morrison, if not for a discovery made by his own enslaved workers during the harvest of 1854. While clearing new fields for cotton cultivation, they unearthed several graves that clearly contained recent remains. The coffins, roughly constructed but made from fresh pine lumber, contained bodies that Morrison's field hands described as children who looked like old men. Morrison's subsequent letter to the county sheriff was never answered, and the graves were quietly reburied. The Civil War brought temporary disruption to the strange pattern of events surrounding the Garrison plantation. Federal troops occupied the area in 1864, and their commanding officer, Colonel Marcus Reed, filed reports that offer a unique outside perspective on the situation they encountered. Reed's dispatches to his superiors described finding the plantation in a state of abandonment, with the main house intact but the slave quarters eerily empty. Most significantly, he reports discovering what he termed extensive burial grounds, containing hundreds of graves, far more than could be accounted for by the plantation's documented population. Colonel Reed's most disturbing discovery was a locked cellar beneath the main house, which contained medical equipment and detailed anatomical drawings that suggested systematic study of human reproduction. His report describes finding preserved specimens in glass containers, though he provides no specific details about their nature. The contents of this cellar were removed by military medical personnel and classified under federal authority. Thomas Garrison himself had disappeared weeks before the federal occupation. His wife, Eleanor, was found in the main house, alive but in a state of complete psychological collapse. She was transported to the state asylum in Milledgeville, where she remained until her death in 1869. The attending physician's notes, preserved in asylum records, describe her persistent delusions about a man she called the Father of Nations, and her conviction that she had witnessed the birth of a new species of human being. The plantation was sold at auction in 1866 to cover debts and taxes. The new owners, a Reconstruction-era investment group from Atlanta, hired local contractors to demolish the slave quarters and build new tenant housing. The demolition workers, mostly freedmen from surrounding counties, reported finding hidden chambers beneath several of the quarter's buildings. These underground spaces contained what appeared to be nurseries, equipped with dozens of cribs and feeding equipment, along with detailed growth charts covering the walls. More disturbing was the discovery of what the workers described as breeding records that went far beyond typical plantation documentation. These papers, many written in Portuguese, contained detailed genealogical charts that traced family lines back several generations while projecting forward into the 20th century. The mathematics involved suggested planning for population growth that would require lifespans far exceeding normal human expectations. The contractor supervising the demolition, a freedman named Abraham Washington, kept a personal diary of the work period that survived among his family papers. His entries describe finding evidence that the underground spaces had been occupied far more recently than the end of slavery would suggest. Fresh bedding, recently used cooking implements, and food stores indicated ongoing habitation even after the plantation's official abandonment. Most unsettling was Washington's account of discovering a hidden room containing what he described as a living museum of children. The room contained dozens of portraits painted in meticulous detail, showing children of various ages, but with unmistakable physical similarities. What disturbed Washington was not just the quantity of portraits, but the dates inscribed beneath each painting. The timeline suggested that some of the children depicted would have been born years after the plantation's abandonment, while others were dated decades into the future. The investigation into these discoveries was undertaken by Dr. Samuel Price, a physician and anthropologist from the University of Georgia who had studied unusual population patterns across the South. His preliminary report, submitted to the State Reconstruction Committee in 1867, documented evidence of what he termed systematic human experimentation that appeared to have continued long beyond the official end of slavery in the region. Dr. Price's research involved interviews with former enslaved people who had lived on the Garrison plantation and survived the war. Their testimonies, recorded in his field notes, paint a consistent picture of a man they universally called Dry Foot, whose presence dominated every aspect of life in the quarters. They described him as unnaturally tall, with skin that seemed resistant to aging despite decades of hard labor under the Georgia sun. The former slaves' accounts of Dry Foot's longevity were supported by plantation records that showed his presence spanning multiple generations of ownership. Bills of sale dating back to 1835 already listed him as a mature adult. Yet witnesses from the 1850s described him as maintaining the same physical appearance and vitality. If the records were accurate, Dryfoot would have been well over 60 years old during his most prolific reproductive period, an age at which enslaved men typically showed significant physical decline. More disturbing than questions of longevity were the testimonies regarding Dryfoot's relationship with the children born on the plantation. Former slaves described a complex social structure within the quarters that revolved around his role as both patriarch and provider. Children who bore his resemblance received special treatment, better food rations, and exemption from the harshest labor assignments. As they matured, many of these children seemed to inherit their father's unusual physical characteristics and longevity. The social dynamics of this arrangement, as described by survivors, suggested a level of organization that transcended typical plantation hierarchy. Dryfoot apparently maintained detailed knowledge of bloodlines and genetic relationships that allowed him to arrange partnerships among his own descendants. This practice, which would have been considered incestuous by conventional standards, was apparently accepted and even encouraged within the closed community of the quarters. Dr. Price's investigation was cut short in 1868 when he disappeared during a research trip to interview additional survivors in neighboring counties. His personal effects were found beside the Coosawattee River, but his research notes and the bulk of his documentation vanished completely. The university declared him dead by drowning and closed his research project without further investigation. The official record of Dr. Price's findings consists only of his preliminary report and a handful of witness testimonies. However, his research assistant, a young man named William Foster, maintained private copies of many documents and continued investigating independently after his mentor's disappearance. Foster's clandestine research, conducted over several years, uncovered evidence that the pattern of unusual births and longevity extended far beyond the Garrison plantation. If you're enjoying the story and feel like helping the channel with any amount, please support us by clicking the thanks button and donating whatever you wish. This really helps the channel keep posting new stories. Foster's investigation, documented in coded journals that were discovered among his papers after his death in 1912, revealed similar anomalies at plantations across northern Georgia, eastern Tennessee, and western North Carolina. In each case, records showed the presence of unusually tall, long-lived slaves of Brazilian or Caribbean origin, accompanied by dramatic increases in birth rates and reports of children with extraordinary physical characteristics. The pattern suggested a coordinated effort that spanned multiple states and decades. Foster's analysis indicated that these individuals were systematically placed on plantations with specific geographic and demographic characteristics. The locations shared common features: isolation from major population centers, access to river transportation, and soil conditions that local folklore associated with Cherokee sacred sites. Foster's most significant discovery was a cache of correspondence hidden in the walls of a burned plantation house in Cherokee County, North Carolina. The letters, written in Portuguese and dated from 1847 to 1863, detailed a breeding program designed to create what the authors termed a superior line of laborers. The correspondence included detailed instructions for maintaining genealogical records and protocols for managing what were clearly viewed as experimental populations. The letters revealed that Dryfoot was not unique, but rather one of several individuals involved in this program. References to our Brazilian colleagues and the Charleston Network suggested an organized effort involving multiple participants across the region. More disturbing was the correspondence's indication that the program was designed to continue beyond the abolition of slavery, with provisions for maintaining bloodlines through post-war sharecropping and tenant farming arrangements. William Foster's death in 1912 marked the end of formal investigation into these events. His widow donated his papers to the State Historical Society, where they were classified as restricted research materials and removed from public access. The classification order, signed by the state historian in 1913, cited sensitive content regarding racial matters and concerns about public misinterpretation of historical data. The Garrison plantation property changed hands multiple times during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Each ownership period was marked by unusual occurrences that local residents attributed to the land's troubled history. Tenant farmers reported finding additional graves during spring plowing, while hunters described encountering unusually tall figures in the woods who seemed to vanish when approached directly. The most persistent reports concerned the continued presence of what locals termed Dryfoot's children in the surrounding countryside. These accounts, passed down through oral tradition, described encounters with individuals who claimed direct descent from the original Brazilian slave. The physical descriptions were remarkably consistent across decades of sightings: extraordinary height, apparent immunity to aging, and an unsettling familiarity with local history that suggested first-hand knowledge of events that predated their apparent age. A federal agricultural survey conducted in 1928 documented several families in the region whose genealogical records showed impossible longevity and reproductive patterns. The survey team, led by Dr. Robert Hayes from the Department of Agriculture, was tasked with studying rural population dynamics in the post-Reconstruction South. Their preliminary findings indicated the presence of genetic anomalies that warranted further investigation. Dr. Hayes's team documented families whose members consistently lived well beyond normal life expectancy while maintaining unusual physical vitality. Birth records suggested that some individuals had been reproducing for periods spanning multiple human generations. The pattern was most pronounced in areas that had once been plantation land, particularly properties with documented connections to the Brazilian breeding programs of the antebellum period. The Agricultural Survey's final report, submitted to federal authorities in 1929, contained recommendations for discreet medical monitoring of certain rural populations. The report's classification status prevented public access, but leaked portions suggested that federal agencies maintained ongoing interest in genetic anomalies that might have military or scientific applications. World War II brought renewed federal attention to the region, when military recruiters noted unusual physical characteristics among potential draftees from specific geographic areas. Young men from families with documented connections to the old plantation breeding programs displayed extraordinary height, physical strength, and apparent resistance to common diseases. These individuals were quietly recruited for special military assignments, and their service records were classified upon completion of their duties. The post-war period saw increased federal investment in medical research facilities throughout the Southeast. Several of these facilities were established in counties with documented histories of genetic anomalies, ostensibly for the study of regional health patterns. Local residents noted that these research stations often employed individuals whose family histories connected them to the old plantation populations. The 1950s brought the first systematic attempt to document the full scope of the breeding program's legacy. A joint investigation by the Centers for Disease Control and the National Institutes of Health identified over 300 individuals across 7 states who appeared to be descendants of the original experimental populations. The investigation's findings were classified under the National Security Act and remain restricted to this day. The research revealed that the genetic modifications achieved through the 19th century breeding programs had stabilized into heritable traits that continued to manifest in subsequent generations. These traits included extended lifespans, enhanced physical capabilities, and reproductive characteristics that allowed for family lines to persist and expand at rates that defied normal demographic patterns. More disturbing was the discovery that many descendants had maintained detailed genealogical records and appeared to be actively managing their bloodlines to preserve and enhance the unusual characteristics. The practice suggested a level of genetic knowledge and organizational capability that exceeded contemporary scientific understanding. The federal investigation also uncovered evidence that descendants of the original breeding programs had achieved positions of influence in various professional and academic fields. Medical doctors, university researchers, and government officials with genetic connections to the experimental populations appeared to be using their positions to facilitate ongoing research and protection of their extended families. The investigation was terminated in 1957, following the mysterious deaths of 3 lead researchers and the disappearance of crucial documentation. The official explanation cited budget constraints and shifting research priorities, but internal memos suggested concerns about the safety of personnel involved in the investigation. The final documented sighting of an individual identified as Dryfoot himself occurred in 1962 during construction of the interstate highway system through northwestern Georgia. Road crews reported encounters with an extremely tall, elderly man who seemed to possess detailed knowledge of local history spanning over a century. The man claimed to be supervising the relocation of family graves that lay in the path of the new highway. Construction foreman James Mitchell documented several conversations with this individual, describing him as articulate, well-informed, and apparently in excellent health, despite claiming to be over 130 years old. Mitchell's reports noted that the man spoke with a slight accent that he identified as possibly Portuguese or Brazilian, and that he carried documents purporting to establish legal claim to dozens of burial sites throughout the region. The highway construction project was delayed for several months, while federal authorities investigated the burial claims. During this period, crews exhumed hundreds of graves from sites that had not been documented in any official records. The remains showed unusual characteristics that attracted the attention of physical anthropologists and medical researchers. Dr. Margaret Chen, a forensic anthropologist from Emory University who participated in the exhumation process, documented skeletal remains that displayed evidence of extended lifespans and unusual genetic characteristics. Her preliminary analysis suggested that many of the interred individuals had lived well beyond normal human life expectancy while maintaining bone density and skeletal structure typical of much younger individuals. The investigation was abruptly terminated when federal authorities classified the burial sites under national security provisions and removed all remains to an undisclosed location. Dr. Chen's research was confiscated, and her participation in the project was classified under the Official Secrets Act. She was subsequently reassigned to unrelated research projects and prohibited from discussing her findings. The highway construction resumed in 1963, following the completion of what officials termed archaeological remediation. The final route was modified to avoid several areas that had been designated as historically sensitive, though no public explanation was provided for these changes. Local residents noted that the avoided areas corresponded to locations with the highest concentrations of anomalous grave sites. The man claiming to be Dryfoot was never seen again after the conclusion of the highway project. Construction workers reported that he had expressed satisfaction with the treatment of the burial sites and had indicated his intention to rest finally after ensuring the proper disposition of his descendants' remains. The 1960s marked the end of documented federal interest in the genetic anomalies associated with the 19th century breeding programs. Official records from this period cite successful conclusion of research objectives and recommend transition of any remaining oversight to local health authorities. However, the classification level of these documents remains at the highest levels of government security. Local folklore in the affected regions continued to include stories of unusually long-lived families and individuals with extraordinary physical characteristics. These accounts became increasingly integrated into regional cultural identity, with many families proudly claiming descent from the original plantation populations, while carefully avoiding discussion of the more disturbing aspects of their heritage. The Garrison Plantation property was eventually incorporated into a state park system in the 1970s. The official park documentation makes no reference to the property's historical significance beyond its role in antebellum agriculture and its brief occupation during the Civil War. Visitors to the park occasionally report finding unmarked grave sites and remnants of underground structures, but these discoveries are typically attributed to Cherokee occupation or early settler activity. Park rangers have documented occasional encounters with unusually tall individuals who seem to possess detailed knowledge of the park's hidden history. These individuals typically claim to be descendants of former slaves or Cherokee residents and demonstrate familiarity with locations and events not covered in official park literature. Rangers are instructed to treat such encounters as routine and to avoid engaging in detailed conversations about local history. The legacy of Dry Foot and the breeding programs of the antebellum South remains largely hidden from public awareness. The scattered documentation that survived federal classification efforts suggests a program of human genetic experimentation that achieved results far beyond the scientific knowledge of its era. The mechanisms by which such results were achieved and the full extent of their persistence in modern populations remain classified under various national security provisions. Contemporary genetic research has identified several heritable traits that appear with unusual frequency in populations descended from certain 19th-century plantation families. These traits include extended lifespans, enhanced disease resistance, and reproductive characteristics that allow for large families across extended periods. However, the historical context for these genetic patterns remains officially unexplored. The story of Dry Foot represents one chapter in a larger historical narrative that continues to influence population genetics across the American South. The careful documentation maintained by federal agencies suggests ongoing monitoring of genetic anomalies that trace their origins to the systematic breeding programs of the slavery era. The full scope of this monitoring and its implications for affected populations remains protected under the highest levels of government classification. Academic researchers who have attempted to study these population patterns have consistently encountered obstacles in accessing historical records and genetic data. Research proposals touching on the genetic legacy of plantation breeding programs are typically denied funding or redirected toward less sensitive topics. The few researchers who have persisted in investigating these matters have experienced career difficulties or have chosen to pursue their research through unofficial channels. The descendants of the original experimental populations continue to live throughout the Southeast, often unaware of their unusual genetic heritage. Many have achieved positions of prominence in their communities and professions, contributing to the economic and cultural development of the region while maintaining the discrete social networks that preserve their extended family relationships. The question of whether the genetic modifications achieved through 19th-century breeding programs represent a beneficial adaptation or a potential threat remains officially unanswered. The classification of related research suggests that federal authorities continue to view this matter as having significant implications for national security, though the specific nature of these concerns is not publicly disclosed. The location of Dry Foot's final resting place, if indeed he has died, remains unknown. Local folklore suggests that he chose a burial site within the state park that now encompasses the former Garrison plantation, but no marked grave has been identified. Park maintenance workers occasionally report finding fresh flowers on unmarked graves throughout the property, placed by unknown visitors who leave no other trace of their presence. The broader implications of the breeding programs extend beyond questions of genetics and longevity to fundamental issues of human identity and social organization. The success of these programs in creating stable, heritable modifications to human populations suggests capabilities that exceeded the scientific understanding of their era and continue to challenge contemporary genetic research. The careful preservation of bloodlines across multiple generations indicates a level of social organization and genetic planning that implies knowledge systems beyond those documented in official historical records. The sources of this knowledge and the mechanisms by which it was transmitted and implemented remain subjects of classified research. The story of Dryfoot and his descendants represents a hidden chapter of American history that continues to influence contemporary population genetics and social organization. The classification of related research and documentation ensures that the full scope of this influence remains unknown to the general public, while descendants of the original experimental populations continue to live with the legacy of genetic modifications achieved through means that remain officially unexplained. Modern genetic screening technologies have the capability to identify the specific genetic markers associated with the enhanced traits found in these populations. However, research into these markers is restricted under federal guidelines that classify such genetic patterns as matters of national security. The rationale for this classification suggests ongoing concerns about the implications of genetic modifications that achieved results beyond contemporary scientific capabilities. The final chapter of this story remains unwritten, as descendants of Dryfoot and the other participants in the antebellum breeding programs continue to live and reproduce across the American South. Their genetic legacy represents a permanent modification to the human genome, achieved through methods that predate modern genetic engineering by more than a century. The full implications of this achievement for human evolution and social development remain classified under the highest levels of government security. Until recently classified documents become available for public research, or until descendants of the experimental populations choose to share their family histories more openly, the complete story of Dryfoot and the genetic modifications he helped create will remain hidden in the shadows of American history. The evidence suggests a program of human genetic experimentation that achieved remarkable success while leaving questions about human nature and scientific possibility that continue to challenge our understanding of what was thought possible in the 19th century. The sound that still echoes through the forests of northwestern Georgia is not the wind through the pines or the flow of the Coosawattee River, but the whispered conversations of families who remember a different version of history than what appears in textbooks. They speak of a man who lived longer than any human should, who fathered more children than medical science could explain, and whose genetic legacy continues to influence population patterns across the American South more than a century after slavery officially ended. Whether Dryfoot was truly the Brazilian giant slave whose life defied natural law, or simply the central figure in a larger program of genetic experimentation that achieved results beyond the science of its time, his story represents one of the most significant and carefully hidden chapters in American history. The classification of related research ensures that the full truth of his legacy may remain hidden for generations to come, while his descendants continue to carry genetic modifications that represent humanity's first successful attempt at directed evolution. In the end, what makes Dryfoot's story truly disturbing is not the possibility that it might be false, but the growing evidence that it might be true. The final piece of documentation surfaced in 1968, when a routine renovation of the Whitfield County Courthouse uncovered a sealed vault containing records that predated the Civil War. Among these documents was a leather-bound ledger written in Portuguese, detailing what appeared to be a comprehensive breeding program spanning multiple states and involving dozens of participants. The ledger, authenticated by federal linguists as genuine 19th-century Brazilian Portuguese, contained genealogical charts that traced family lines forward into the 20th century with mathematical precision. The calculations included projected lifespans, reproductive periods, and population growth rates that assumed genetic modifications far beyond the medical knowledge of the 1850s. Most disturbing was the ledger's final entry, dated 1865, which described the successful completion of Phase 1 and outlined plans for a dormancy period lasting approximately 100 years. The entry suggested that the visible aspects of the breeding program were designed to be temporary, with the true genetic modifications programmed to manifest in later generations. Federal authorities classified the ledger immediately upon its discovery and removed it from county custody. The renovation workers who found the vault were required to sign non-disclosure agreements, and the existence of the documents was never officially acknowledged. However, copies of several pages were secretly photographed by a courthouse clerk named Robert Mills, whose family had lived in the county since before the Civil War. Mills' photographs, discovered among his personal effects after his death in 1987, revealed genetic planning that extended well into the 21st century. The Portuguese calculations included provisions for genetic expression that would remain dormant for multiple generations before manifesting in descendants who would carry enhanced traits while appearing completely normal to casual observation. The implications of this delayed genetic expression became apparent during the 1990s, when medical researchers began documenting unusual longevity patterns among certain families in the Southeast. Individuals with documented ancestry connecting them to the old plantation populations began displaying enhanced immune systems, extended lifespans, and reproductive capabilities that exceeded normal human parameters. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, a geneticist at the CDC who studied these patterns, documented cases of individuals in their 70s and 80s displaying physical capabilities typically associated with people 30 years younger. Her research, conducted under federal oversight, identified specific genetic markers that appeared to activate during middle age, triggering enhanced physical and mental capabilities. The research was terminated in 1999 when several study participants began demonstrating cognitive abilities that exceeded the parameters of the research protocol. Dr. Hernandez's final report, classified immediately upon submission, described subjects who appeared to possess intuitive understanding of genetic principles that exceeded contemporary scientific knowledge. The pattern of enhanced capabilities appeared to be spreading through family lines in ways that suggested intentional genetic programming rather than random mutation. Affected individuals demonstrated unusual success in academic and professional fields, particularly in areas related to medicine, genetics, and biological research. By the early 21st century, descendants of the original breeding programs had achieved positions of influence throughout American society. Their enhanced longevity and cognitive capabilities allowed them to accumulate knowledge and resources across extended lifespans while maintaining the appearance of normal human development. The true scope of Dryfoot's legacy became apparent in 2007. When a comprehensive genetic survey conducted by the Department of Defense identified over 10,000 individuals across the United States who carried genetic markers associated with the 19th century breeding programs. The survey's findings suggested that the genetic modifications had stabilized into heritable traits that would continue to propagate through the general population. The survey also revealed that affected individuals had maintained sophisticated genealogical networks that allowed them to track and manage their extended family relationships across multiple generations. These networks operated below the threshold of official detection, while facilitating genetic planning that ensured the preservation and enhancement of the modified traits. The final confirmation of Dryfoot's continued influence came in 2015, when federal researchers investigating unusual population genetics in rural Georgia encountered a community of individuals who claimed direct descent from the original Brazilian breeding program. These individuals displayed physical characteristics consistent with the 19th century descriptions of Dryfoot himself: extraordinary height, apparent immunity to aging, and reproductive capabilities that defied medical explanation. The community had maintained detailed genealogical records spanning over 150 years, documenting genetic modifications that had been carefully preserved and enhanced through selective breeding practices that continued into the modern era. Their records included detailed knowledge of genetic engineering techniques that preceded official scientific discovery by decades. Most significantly, the community possessed documentation suggesting that Dryfoot himself had survived well into the 20th century, maintaining his role as patriarch and genetic architect until at least 1970. Photographs from the community's archives showed an individual matching historical descriptions of Dryfoot at various ages spanning over a century, with minimal signs of physical aging despite the passage of decades. The federal investigation of this community was classified at the highest levels of national security, with all personnel required to undergo extensive background checks and psychological evaluation. The investigation's findings remain classified, but leaked documents suggest that the genetic modifications achieved through the 19th century breeding programs represent the most successful example of directed human evolution in recorded history. The legacy of Dryfoot extends beyond genetics into fundamental questions about human nature and the possibilities of directed evolution. His story suggests that systematic genetic modification of human populations was not only possible using 19th century techniques, but achieved results that continue to influence American society in ways that remain officially hidden. The descendants of his breeding program now live throughout American society, carrying genetic modifications that provide them with enhanced capabilities while maintaining the appearance of normal human development. Their influence in fields related to genetics, medicine, and biological research ensures that the knowledge gained through their ancestors' experiments continues to advance human understanding of genetic modification. The classification of research into these genetic modifications suggests that federal authorities view the descendants of Dryfoot's breeding program as both a valuable resource and a potential security concern. Their enhanced capabilities and extended lifespans make them natural leaders in fields related to genetic research, while their genetic distinctiveness raises questions about their loyalty to conventional human society. The story of Dryfoot represents the beginning of a genetic modification program that achieved its ultimate success not in the 19th century, but in the 21st century, when his descendants finally inherited the enhanced capabilities that their ancestor had programmed into their genetic code. The full implications of this genetic legacy for human evolution and social organization remain classified under the highest levels of government security. Today, as genetic engineering becomes a mainstream scientific discipline, the achievements of Dryfoot and his contemporaries serve as proof that directed human evolution was not only possible using primitive techniques, but achieved results that modern science is only beginning to understand. His legacy lives on in thousands of descendants who carry genetic modifications that represent humanity's first successful attempt at controlling its own evolutionary development. The sound that echoes through the forests of Georgia is no longer just the whisper of wind through pine trees, but the quiet conversation of families who remember their true heritage and continue the genetic planning that their ancestor began over 170 years ago. They are the living proof that Dryfoot's amazing life was not a legend or folklore, but the documented beginning of humanity's genetic future. In the end, the most disturbing aspect of Dryfoot's story is not that it challenges our understanding of what was possible in the past, but that it reveals what is happening in the present. His descendants walk among us, enhanced by genetic modifications achieved through methods that predate modern science, carrying the legacy of humanity's first successful attempt at directed evolution into an uncertain future. The amazing life of Dryfoot did not end with his death, but continues in the genetic code of thousands of Americans who carry his modifications in their DNA, ensuring that his influence on human evolution will persist for generations to come.